The forest was cold and silent, the kind of silence that made a person hold their breath without knowing why. The trees stood tall like dark towers, their bare branches scratching at the cloudy night sky. A pale moon hid behind drifting clouds, letting only a few rays of silver light touch the ground. The air was heavy, filled with the smell of wet earth and fallen leaves. Far away, something moved, a shadow slipping between the trees. Then came the sound, a cry, soft but sharp, cutting through the silence like a knife. It was not the cry of a bird or the howl of a wolf. It was something different. Something wounded. It echoed again, weak and trembling, as if whatever made it was losing strength. A human figure walked along a narrow path, boots crunching the leaves underfoot. He carried a small lantern that swayed with each step, casting shaky light on the ground. His coat was old and patched, and his breath rose in pale clouds before his face. He stopped, tilting his head toward the sound. There it was again, the same cry, faint but full of pain. It tugged at something deep inside him, though he did not know why. He knew this forest well, and he knew the kinds of creatures that lived here. Some were harmless, some were deadly, but the cry, it sounded too small to be dangerous, and yet too desperate to ignore. He left the path, pushing past low branches, the lantern's light bouncing against the trees. The cry grew louder, sharper, until at last he found the source. In a small patch of moonlight lay a creature unlike any he had ever seen so close. It was a dragon hatchling, no bigger than a large cat, its scales a soft shade of silver blue. Its tiny body trembled as it tried to move, but one wing hung limp and twisted, the other wing folded tightly against its side. Its eyes were wide, glowing faintly like warm amber in the dark. A thin line of blood ran down its side, staining the pale leaves beneath it. The man froze, his mind racing. Dragons were rare here, dangerous, yes, but also mysterious. He had only ever seen them far in the sky, flying like shadows across the clouds. But this one was no threat, not tonight. The hatchling hissed weakly, a sound meant to scare, but there was no strength in it. It tried to shuffle backward, but its claws slipped on the damp ground. The man knelt slowly, setting the lantern on the ground so its light could fall gently over the creature. He could see the broken wing more clearly now, bent at an unnatural angle. The wounds were fresh, the skin around them swollen and raw. The poor thing had been hurt recently, and badly. Then he heard it. Another sound, deeper and heavier. Then the hatchling's cry, the crunch of boots on the forest floor. Voices low but close, hunters. The man's chest tightened. He knew what would happen if they found the hatchling. A rare creature like this would be killed for its scales, bones, or even captured and sold. He looked back at the small dragon. It stared at him, not with trust, but with a kind of hopelessness, as if it already knew what was coming. The voices were getting closer, their laughter sharp in the cold night. He could even hear the metallic clink of weapons and traps. He had no time to think. Slowly, he reached out his hand toward the hatchling. It tensed, its good wing flaring slightly, but it did not move away. His fingers brushed its scales. Warm despite the cold air, he whispered softly, words he wasn't even sure the creature could understand. The hatchling blinked, its breathing uneven. Then, with a small shiver, it allowed him to touch its head fully. It was an unspoken choice, a silent plea for help. He lifted it carefully, feeling how light it was, lighter than it should be. The broken wing lay against his arm, and he wrapped his coat around its body to hide it from sight. The man took one last glance at the path. Behind him, the hunters were close, too close, but the forest was his home. He knew its turns and shadows like the lines of his own hands. He moved quickly, his steps quiet, weaving between trees and slipping into deeper darkness. The hatchling made no sound now, only pressed its head against his chest. Perhaps it knew that being silent was the only way to survive. The voices faded slightly, but he could still hear them searching. They would not give up easily. He gritted his teeth, determined. Tonight, no matter the cost, He would not let this creature die. The man's cabin was not far, but the path was tricky in the dark. Roots curled like snakes under the leaves, ready to trip anyone not watching their step. The lantern's light swung with each movement, throwing strange shapes onto the trees. The hatchling stayed still in his arms, but its eyes remained open, bright, and watchful. Every now and then, it gave a small twitch, as if ready to leap away if he made a wrong move. When they finally reached the clearing, the man could see the outline of his home. It was a small wooden cabin with a slatted roof and a stone chimney. Smoke drifted slowly into the cold night air, carrying the faint smell of burning pine. He pushed open the door with his shoulder, stepping into the warmth inside. The fire in the hearth glowed gently, filling the room with soft light. He sat the hatchling down on a thick wool blanket near the fire. It blinked against the sudden brightness, shifting its claws on the fabric. The man removed his coat, shaking off a few drops of dew. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. One human, one dragon. There was no trust yet. Only curiosity mixed with caution. The man knelt again, keeping his hands low so as not to startle it. The hatchling gave a soft hiss, its tail curling around itself, but its movements were slow, its strength clearly fading. He pulled a small wooden bowl from a shelf and filled it with fresh water from a clay jug, pushing it gently toward the hatchling. He sat back, waiting. At first, it only stared at the bowl, as if unsure what it was for. Then slowly, it lowered its head and sniffed. The tip of its snout touched the surface, making tiny ripples. It drank cautiously, small gulps at first, then faster, as if realizing how thirsty it truly was. When it finally stopped, a drop of water hung at the tip of its mouth, reflecting the firelight. The man smiled faintly, though he knew this was only a small step. Next, he checked the broken wing more carefully. The hatchling tensed but did not pull away. The injury was worse than he thought. The bone felt out of place, and the skin was bruised and torn. He fetched a strip of clean cloth and a jar of salve made from herbs. The smell of the ointment filled the cabin, sharp and earthy. He spoke in a calm, low voice as he worked, not to explain, but to reassure. The hatchling winced once when he touched a tender spot, but otherwise stayed still when he finished. The wing was wrapped neatly, held close to its body for support. The hatchling looked at him, its golden eyes seeming a little softer now. It made a low, rumbling sound, not a growl, but something almost like a purr. The man sat back, feeling the heat of the fire on his face. For the first time that night, there was no sound from outside, no footsteps, no hunters, just the quiet crackle of the flames and the slow breathing of the creature on the blanket. Still, he knew the danger wasn't gone. Hunters did not give up easily when there was something valuable to find, and this little one was valuable beyond measure. He glanced toward the door, half expecting to hear a knock or the crash of boots. But the night remained still. He decided to let the hatchling rest while he stayed alert. The dragon shifted slightly, curling into the blanket like a cat, its tail wrapped over its nose, and its eyes closed. The man couldn't help but notice how small it looked, so different from the terrifying beasts of legend. Up close, it was almost fragile. He wondered what had happened to it before he found it. Was it abandoned? Injured in a fight? Left behind because it couldn't keep up? Whatever the truth was, the forest had been ready to finish what fate had started. But tonight, that story had changed. He leaned back in his chair, the wooden frame creaking under his weight. The firelight painted warm gold on the hatchling's silver-blue scales. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, carrying the distant call of an owl. Somewhere in the darkness, danger still waited. But here, in this small cabin, there was a fragile safety. And though neither human nor dragon could understand each other's words, something unspoken had already begun to grow between them. Not yet trust, not yet friendship, but the first spark of both. The river carried them far from the clearing where the cabin had stood. Mist clung to the water's surface, curling around the small boat like pale fingers. The man rowed slowly now, his muscles aching from the long escape. Beside him, the hatchling crouched low, its golden eyes scanning the dark banks for movement. Hours passed before the sounds of pursuit faded completely. Only the rush of the water and the distant calls of night birds remained. When the sun began to rise, the fog started to lift. The river opened into a wider stretch, lined with tall reeds and low willows that dipped their branches into the current. The man steered the boat toward the shore, pulling it up onto the soft, damp earth. He stepped out, feeling the ground sink slightly beneath his boots. The hatchling followed, shaking itself and stretching its legs. It blinked in the morning light, its scales catching a faint shimmer from the rising sun. They moved inland until they found a sheltered grove. The trees grew close together here, their branches thick enough to block most of the sky. The man set down his pack and sat against a moss-covered log. The hatchling settled beside him, not on its blanket this time, but close enough that its side brushed his arm. He didn't move away. Instead, he let the quiet of the grove settle over them like a warm blanket. For the first time in days, they were not running. The man knew this was only a pause. The hunters would keep searching, but in this moment, that didn't matter. He reached into his pack, pulling out a strip of dried meat and offering it to the hatchling. It took the food without hesitation, chewing slowly. When it finished, it stayed near him instead of moving away. The shift was small, but it carried the weight of everything they had been through. Over the next few days, they stayed in the grove. The man used fallen branches and woven reeds to build a small lean-to for shelter. The hatchling explored the edges of the grove, but never strayed too far. Sometimes it brought back small things, a smooth stone, a feather, dropping them near where he sat. He didn't know if these were gifts, but he kept them, tucking them into a small pouch. Each day, the hatchling's injured wing grew a little stronger. It still couldn't open it fully, but it could stretch it now without crying out in pain. At night, they would lie beside the small fire he built, the hatchling often resting its head near his side. In the darkness, he would sometimes feel it stir, as if watching him. One night, as the firelight danced across its scales, it made a low, deep sound. It wasn't a growl, it was something softer, a sound he hadn't heard before, he realized. It was speaking in its own way, telling him it knew he had saved it, and that it belonged here with him on the fifth morning in the grove. The man woke to the sound of wings overhead. He looked up through the branches and saw them, larger dragons, circling high above. The hatchling lifted its head, staring at them with wide eyes. For a moment, he thought it might run toward the clearing, but instead, it pressed closer to him, its body tense but unmoving. He understood then. These might have been its kind, but they were not its family. Family was no longer about blood or wings. It was about the one who stayed, the one who fought for you when everyone else left you behind. The dragons passed without landing, disappearing into the pale clouds. The hatchling's body relaxed again, and it turned its head to look at him. There was no fear in its gaze now, only trust. The kind of trust that didn't come easily and couldn't be broken once it was earned. As the days passed, the man began to plan for the future. They would need to keep moving, find places where the hunters would never think to search. The hatchling's wing would heal in time, and when it did, it would be able to fly. But for now, they would walk the earth together, and no matter what dangers came, they would face them side by side. That night, as the fire burned low and the forest around them settled into quiet, the hatchling curled against him, its warm scales pressing into his side. The man rested a hand on its back, feeling the steady rhythm of its breath. For the first time since the night he heard that lonely cry in the forest, he allowed himself to rest fully. They had survived the hunters, the cold, and the fear, and though their journey was far from over, they were no longer just a man and a dragon. They were something more, something unshakable, a bond that could not be broken. The night outside had grown colder. the wind scraping against the wooden walls like claws. The man sat in his chair, staring into the fire, listening for anything unusual. The hatchling lay curled on the blanket, its sides rising and falling. With slow breaths, the room was quiet, but his ears kept catching small sounds in the distance. The faint crack of a branch, the shift of leaves under heavy feet. He had lived long enough in these woods to know when something was out there. Then it came, a faint whistle, short and sharp, the kind hunters used to signal each other. His stomach tightened. He stood quickly, crossing the room to blow out the lantern, leaving only the dim glow of the hearth. The shadows thickened, swallowing the corners of the cabin. The hatchling lifted its head, its golden eyes glowing faintly in the dark, sensing the tension. The man crouched beside it, placing a finger to his lips in a silent warning. Of course, the creature could not understand human gestures, but it seemed to know it must stay quiet. He scooped it up, careful not to jar the injured wing. It made a soft, low sound, not fear, but awareness. He crossed to the far side of the cabin, moving to a small wooden hatch set in the floor, pulling it open. He revealed a narrow space below, a storage pit for winter supplies. Right now, it would serve as a hiding place. He set the hatchling inside on a folded blanket. The little dragon shifted, its tail twitching, but stayed still when he rested a hand on its head. The man's eyes met its gaze in the flickering light. No words, just an understanding. He closed the hatch slowly, covering it with a small rug. The cabin now looked as ordinary as any woodsman's home. A knock came, sudden and loud. The sound echoed through the small space, and for a moment, the man said nothing. Then came another knock, this time harder. He walked to the door, unhurried, as if he had just been roused from sleep. When he opened it, 3 figures stood outside, their breath steaming in the cold air. Their clothes were rough and patched, but the weapons they carried were well kept: crossbows, long knives, and a heavy spear. "Evening," one of them said, his voice carrying the edge of someone who wasn't really greeting you. The man nodded, leaning casually against the doorframe. "What brings you this far into the woods at night?" he asked, his tone calm. The tallest of the hunters stepped forward, his eyes sharp. "We're tracking something rare," he said. "Small dragon, silver scales, fresh injury on one wing. Seen anything?" The man shook his head slowly, letting his expression stay unreadable. "Only deer and foxes around here," he replied. "No dragons. Not in years." The hunters exchanged looks, clearly not convinced. One of them stepped past him without asking, looking around the cabin. The man didn't move to stop him. That would only raise suspicion. Instead, he stepped aside, his face relaxed but his mind alert. The hunter's boots thumped against the wooden floor. He glanced at the fire, the shelves, the table. His eyes passed over the rug that hid the hatch, and for a moment, the man's pulse quickened. But the hunter only shrugged and moved to check the back wall. Meanwhile, the other 2 scanned the room from the doorway. Their eyes lingered on the shadows, as if expecting something to emerge. Finally, the tallest hunter spoke again. "If you see it, you'd best tell us. That kind of thing isn't safe to keep." The man gave a small nod. "I'll remember," he said simply. They stood for a moment longer, clearly weighing whether to push further. Then the tallest one turned away. "Come on," he muttered to the others. "We'll sweep the east ridge." The man closed the door after them, waiting until the sound of their boots faded into the forest. Only then did he move to the rug, lifting it to open the hatch. Golden eyes stared up at him, unblinking. He reached in and lifted the hatchling out, feeling its tiny claws grip his sleeve. It was warm against him. Though he could feel its heart beating fast, the hunters might be gone for now, but they would be back. He knew he could not stay here much longer. He set the hatchling back on the blanket near the fire. It made a small sound, almost like relief, before curling up again. The man stared into the flames, his thoughts dark. This was no longer just a matter of hiding a creature. By saving it, he had tied his own fate to it, and he knew, sooner or later, The hunters would force him to choose between protecting his own life or protecting the small, broken-winged dragon that had come into it. The fire had burned low, its light now a soft orange glow that flickered against the wooden walls. The man sat cross-legged on the floor beside the hatchling, watching as it shifted slightly on the blanket. It had fallen asleep again, its tail curled protectively around its body, its small chest rising and falling in a slow rhythm. For the first time since finding it, he noticed just how light its breathing had become, almost peaceful. It was hard to believe that only hours ago, this creature had been alone in the cold forest, abandoned and wounded. The man leaned back, feeling the ache in his shoulders from carrying it through the night. He glanced toward the door, knowing that beyond it lay danger. The hunters could return at any time. But here, inside this small cabin, the air felt different. It was warmer, calmer, though beneath it all, there was still a thin thread of tension. He wondered if the dragon sensed it too. In the corner, a small pot hung above the fire, its contents bubbling quietly. The man reached over, stirred it once, and then poured a little of the broth into a wooden bowl. He placed it near the hatchling, not too close to startle it. The scent of meat and herbs seemed to stir the creature. Its golden eyes blinked open slowly, catching the glow of the fire. For a moment, it simply stared at the bowl, then at him. It made a soft, questioning sound, almost like a bird's call. The man pushed the bowl a little closer, speaking in a low voice. "Go on," he murmured, though he knew it would not understand the words. Still, something in his tone seemed to reach the creature. It sniffed at the broth, hesitated, and then began to eat. The way it moved was cautious, as if it expected the food to be taken away at any moment. He sat quietly watching, letting it eat without interruption. Trust could not be forced. It had to be earned slowly, step by step. When the hatchling finished, it licked the edge of the bowl before pulling back. Its eyes met his for a brief second, and he thought he saw something change in them. Not trust, not yet, but the first spark of recognition. Later, he unwrapped the bandage on its broken wing. The swelling had gone down a little, but the damage was still bad. He worked carefully, his fingers steady, applying fresh ointment and wrapping the wing again. The hatchling flinched once when the cloth tightened, but it did not pull away. Instead, it kept its gaze on him, almost studying his face as he worked. By the time he tied the final knot, its breathing had slowed again, a small sign of relief. The man set the creature back on the blanket and reached for a small piece of wood. With a knife, he began carving. Not for any purpose, but to keep his hands busy. The rhythmic scrape of the blade filled the silence, blending with the soft crackle of the fire. The hatchling watched him for a while, then shifted closer, drawn by the warmth. Its scales caught the light, reflecting a faint shimmer of blue. When he stopped carving, the man rested his hand near the blanket, palm open. The hatchling hesitated, its head tilting slightly. Then, with slow, cautious steps, it moved forward and placed its snout against his fingers. The contact was brief, but it was enough. He stayed still, letting it choose when to pull away, and when it did, he felt something inside him settle. The first thread of trust had been tied. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, carrying the faint sound of something far away, maybe the hunters, maybe just the forest shifting in the night. The man's eyes flicked toward the window. He knew they could not stay here forever. The hunters would search every cabin, every clearing, every shadow until they found what they wanted. But moving too soon would risk the hatchling's life. It needed time to heal before it could even think of surviving on its own. He leaned back, pulling a thick fur from the bed and laying it near the fire. The hatchling stretched out slightly, settling on the blanket with a soft, almost contented sigh. The man watched as its eyes drifted closed. Somewhere in that small, fragile body was the heart of a creature that could one day soar above mountains and rivers. But for now, it was just a wounded soul, and for reasons he could not explain, he had decided to be the one to keep it safe, no matter the cost. He turned his gaze back to the fire, the flames dancing in quiet patterns, somewhere beyond the walls of this cabin. The world was waiting, a dangerous world that had no mercy for the weak. But here, for this one night, there was warmth, there was quiet, and there was the fragile beginning of something neither man nor dragon fully understood. Something that, if given time, might change both their lives forever. Morning came slow and quiet. The first light of day slipped through the small window, painting soft gold across the cabin walls. The man woke to the faint sound of movement, not from outside, but from the blanket near the fire. The hatchling was awake, stretching its neck and testing its good wing. Its broken wing stayed pressed against its body. But there was a spark of energy in its movements that hadn't been there before. The man rose from his bed, his boots creaking on the wooden floor. The hatchling froze for a moment, eyes fixed on him. Then, when he didn't come closer, it relaxed. Again, he smiled faintly, realizing how each day it seemed a little less afraid. Still cautious, yes, but no longer trembling at every step he took. He crouched down and placed a small bowl of fresh water on the floor. This time, the hatchling moved toward it without hesitation. It drank deeply, then lifted its head and looked at him. There was something in its gaze, not just awareness, but a kind of question, as if it wanted to know what he would do next. The man stepped outside to fetch breakfast, leaving the door open so the light could spill into the room. The air outside was sharp with cold, and frost clung to the grass. Like tiny crystals, he checked the traps he had set the night before, finding a pair of rabbits caught cleanly. When he returned, the hatchling was still there. Sitting near the doorway, it didn't try to escape. It only watched him as he entered. Its head tilting slightly, he set the rabbits down on the table and began cleaning them with practiced hands. The hatchling's eyes followed his every move. When the meat began to cook over the fire, its nose twitched at the smell. He cut a small, tender piece and placed it near the blanket. The hatchling sniffed it, then ate, its sharp little teeth working quickly. When it finished, it made a low sound, almost like a rumble, and glanced back at him. He didn't know if it was thanks, but it felt like it. Over the next few days, they began to fall into a quiet rhythm. The man would rise early to tend to his traps and gather wood. The hatchling would explore the cabin, sniffing at shelves and peering under the bed. It never touched anything it wasn't given. At first, he thought this was just the behavior of a cautious creature. But soon he began to realize it was also the start of understanding. Sometimes he would sit on the floor and whittle pieces of wood. The hatchling would sit nearby, watching the shavings fall like curled leaves. When he moved his hands, it would follow each motion with surprising focus. One afternoon, it even nudged a stick toward him, as if offering him something to carve. He chuckled softly, taking the stick and giving it back after shaping it into a small, smooth spiral. The hatchling turned it over in its claws, examining it like it was a strange treasure. At night, when the fire burned low, the hatchling would edge closer to him. Not touching, not yet, but close enough that he could feel the faint heat from its body. Once, as he dozed in the chair, he woke to find it sleeping against his boot. It startled when he moved, but it didn't run. Instead, it simply shifted back to its blanket. The man said nothing, but inside, he knew this was a sign. The walls between them were slowly coming down, yet even as their bond grew, the outside world was not silent. Every so often, he would hear distant voices in the forest. Sometimes the deep thump of something heavy moving through the trees. Once, he even caught sight of smoke rising from the east ridge, too much to be from a campfire. The hunters were still searching, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they came this way again. He began making quiet preparations, gathering extra food, checking the strength of the small boat he kept by the river. If the time came to flee, they would need to move fast. The hatchling watched him work, its eyes sharp and alert. It didn't understand the danger in human terms, but it seemed to sense that something beyond these walls was waiting for them. One evening, as the sun sank behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of fire, The man sat on the porch steps with the hatchling beside him. They watched the river glisten in the fading light. The hatchling's head rested on its front claws. And for a moment, it looked content. He reached out, hesitated, then gently touched the top of its head. It didn't pull away. Instead, it leaned into the touch. Its eyes half closing. In that moment, the man realized something. This was no longer just a creature he had rescued. This was a friend, and he would fight for it. The day began like any other. Cold air rolling in from the river and mist curling through the trees. The man had just finished checking his traps when he heard it. A sound that froze him in place. It was faint at first. A deep thud in the distance, followed by the sharp crack of branches snapping under heavy weight. Then came the sound of voices closer than they had been in days. Low, steady, and too many to count. He crouched low, scanning the tree line. Through the fog, he caught the glint of metal, armor, weapons, and something worse. Large nets strung between poles, carried by 2 men at a time. They were not just hunting now, they were sweeping the forest. The man's jaw tightened. If they found the cabin, they would search every inch until they uncovered the hatchling. He moved quickly, keeping low as he slipped back through the trees. Toward home, every step felt louder than it should, every snapped twig a warning. When he reached the clearing, the hatchling was sitting just outside the cabin, watching the tree line with alert eyes. It gave a soft, sharp sound when it saw him. As if sensing his unease, he rushed forward, scooping it into his arms before it could move. Inside the cabin, he shut the door quietly. His mind raced. The river route was risky, but staying here meant certain capture. The hatchling shifted. In his arms, making a low rumble, he set it down on the blanket and began gathering supplies, dried meat, a water skin, a roll of bandages. Every movement was fast but careful, the way a man moves when every second counts. The sound of boots came next. Closer now, heavy on the frozen ground. The man blew out the fire in the hearth, plunging the cabin into dim light. The hatchling moved closer to him, its golden eyes glowing faintly in the shadows. A knock came at the door, hard and sharp. He didn't answer. Instead, he slipped toward the hatch in the floor, lifting it and motioning for the hatchling to go in. This time, it didn't hesitate. Dropping into the space and crouching low, the knock came again, followed by a voice. "Open up, woodsman. We know you're in there." The man stayed silent, outside. Boots scraped on the porch, then the door shook under a heavy shove. He slid a wooden bar across the inside, locking it tight. From the shadows of the hatch, the hatchling's head peeked up, its eyes locked on him. He placed a hand over the opening and whispered softly, "Stay quiet." The voices outside grew sharper. "Break it down," one of them said. The cabin door rattled under a hard kick. He knew it wouldn't hold for long. Without thinking, he grabbed his pack and slung it over his shoulder. He opened the hatch again and lifted the hatchling into his arms. Its claws gripped his coat, its body tense but silent. A crash came from the front as the lock gave way. The man turned and slipped out the back window into the cold night air. He landed softly, knees bending to take the weight. The fog wrapped around him, hiding his form as he sprinted toward the river. Behind him, the hunters shouted, their voices cutting through the mist like blades. The ground was uneven, the roots and rocks threatening to trip him with every step. But he kept running, the hatchling held tight against his chest. When the first arrow hissed past his ear, he didn't slow. Another struck a tree beside him. The wood splintering, the sound of pursuit grew louder. They were closing in at last. The river came into view, its surface dark and moving fast. The small boat sat where he had left it, tied to a thick post. He shoved it into the water and jumped. In pulling the hatchling close as he grabbed the oars, the boat rocked under his weight, the cold spray of the river hitting his face. From the bank, the hunters appeared, shouting and pointing. One raised a crossbow, but the fog thickened, hiding the boat as it drifted downstream. For a long while, there was only the sound of rushing water and the pounding of his own heartbeat. The hatchling stayed pressed against him, its breathing quick but steady. The danger was not gone. The hunters would not stop, but for now, they had slipped away. He looked down at the small creature in his arms. Its eyes met his, and in them, he saw not fear, but something fiercer, trust. And that trust gave him the strength to keep going, no matter how far they would have to run.